Hey Super Mamas, it's Dr. Joy here and you are watching Delivering Joy MD TV. Welcome to Super Mama Sunday, where we just kicked out a series on preterm birth. And y'all, I have been researching the latest, greatest statistics about preterm birth, and I have got some real news for you this week. Today, I'm going to be talking about the top 5 causes of preterm birth based on the new literature that's out there. So make sure you keep watching because I think you might be surprised, like I was, about some of the newest findings out there. So keep watching, y'all. All right, Super Mamas, let's jump into this because today's video is not long, but it is power-packed with information. I'm going to be talking about the top 5 causes of preterm birth based on the most current literature that's out there. So most of y'all probably not as old as me, but I remember watching the top 40 countdown or listening to it on the radio. And anytime you're doing a countdown, right, you want to start with like the highest number and work your way down to number 1. I was kind of surprised about what number 1 is, and I think you might be too, but we are going to start with number 5, of course. So number 5. So number 5 is actually cervical incompetence, or the cervix actually not being strong enough to hold the pregnancy. And number 5 may actually be associated with number 2. So we're not really quite sure about number 5. So number 5 is kind of iffy, but number 5 deals with a diagnosis that some folks get called cervical incompetence, and this is where the cervix just opens without any labor pains or contractions, and the cervix has what's called painless dilation. And so the cervix just kind of starts to open, and usually what happens is the bag of water, or what we call the membranes, are exposed to the vagina, and the bag of water will break and the pregnancy just kind of comes out. And most times moms may not have any symptoms until the baby is actually coming out. And this usually happens in second trimester, and normally it happens before the baby is actually able to live outside of the mom. So normally see this happening like in the late teens, like so 17, 18, 19 weeks, maybe 20 weeks, 22 weeks. So it's very devastating when it occurs. Sometimes women may have their babies at home. Sometimes they think they may have to go to the bathroom, but really the baby is actually coming through the birth canal. So if you've ever heard of people having a baby at home suddenly, or having a baby in the toilet, this may be the cause. So cervical incompetence is a devastating thing that occurs, and many times women may lose 1 or 2 babies before they're actually diagnosed. One of the things that I've been doing in my practice is cervical length when we are doing our second trimester ultrasound, just to look at the length of the cervix, because this is really happening as we are in our second trimester, and the cervix is just getting shorter and shorter. So by measuring the cervical length, you can sometimes tell if a mom may be developing cervical incompetence, and so you can sometimes catch it in advance. Also, sometimes with cervical incompetence, moms may develop vaginal bleeding. If you're having symptoms of vaginal bleeding, weird spotting, it's always good to have that evaluated and just kind of rule out that anything is going on that's strange with the cervix. If you had a second trimester loss, that's something to mention to your OB care provider. So cervical incompetence is number 5 for a cause of spontaneous preterm birth. The way that we deal with that is usually by placing a cervical cerclage. And a cerclage is actually a stitch that goes around the cervix. It's like a purse string. So if you ever saw one of those purses that has the little string around the outside where you can actually pull it tight and then cinch it down, that's exactly what we do with the cervix. We put a stitch around it, we tie that knot down, and it holds the cervix shut, and we leave it on there until you reach term, or usually 37 weeks, and then we actually remove the stitch. So that helps women who have cervical incompetence be able to carry a pregnancy to term. So let's move on to number 4. Number 4 is uterine distension. And by uterine distension, it means stretching of the uterus. So the more the uterus gets stretched, the more the body kind of thinks that you're at full term. So this can happen sometimes, like when women have way too much fluid around their babies. So that's called polyhydramnios. Polyhydramnios basically is a big word that means a lot of fluid. So if the uterus is just overstretched, even though the baby may not be term yet, the body may be tricked into believing that you're already at term, and you'll start to have contractions. Also, if you have more than one baby in there, so if you have twins or quadruplets or sextuplets, the uterus definitely will be overstretched and can start having uterine contractions too early. So any reason why the uterus may be much larger than it should be early on in the pregnancy can cause that. So you want to think about conditions that may cause the uterus to be larger than it should be. And that can cause you to have early contractions and possibly have early labor and early birth. Number 3 is placental separation. And that really basically just means the placenta is coming off the wall of the uterus. The placenta is separating away from the wall of the uterus. And this is your classic placental abruption, or separation of the placenta prematurely and bleeding occurring between the placenta and the uterine wall. And we've talked about this in other videos, but our top 2 reasons that we might have a placental abruption are number 1, trauma, and number 2, high blood pressures. Those are our top 2 reasons. So even minor traumas like a fender bender or a slip and fall can cause placental abruption. So it's really important, if you start having bleeding after a fall, or you start having contractions after a fall or a fender bender, it is important that you go in and be evaluated by your OB care team, usually in your delivery center where you're planning to have your baby, so that you can make sure that you're okay. Even if you feel okay, you want to make sure that you go in and do some monitoring to make sure that you're not having contractions, that your baby looks okay, that your vital signs are okay, because even minor traumas can cause some major issues like placental abruption. The other one that I just mentioned, preeclampsia, where your blood pressures suddenly spike, that sudden spike in pressure can cause the placenta to tear off the side wall of the uterus. And when that placenta separates from the side wall of the uterus, it tells your body that it's go time. It's like, hey, the placenta has separated from the side wall of the uterus. It's time for the baby to get out of here. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how that kind of disconnect between the uterus and the placenta can cause a cascade of hormones that is like, hey, time to evacuate the baby because we're not getting enough oxygen from the uterus to the placenta. So whenever that takes place, it's like an evacuation plan for the baby, because baby's no longer able to get oxygen and nutrients inside of the uterine environment. So it's like, hey, time to pull the plug. We need a parachute. Let's get out of here. All right, guys, we're down to number 2. Number 2 is one I really want to spend a little bit of time on, and that's infection or inflammatory processes. So this is one we should really think about and kind of understand a little bit, because there are lots of potential ways that we could have infections during pregnancy. Some of them are things that we can control, and some of them are not. But the ones we can control are definitely ones that we want to try to control. So the first one is the vaginal microbiome. And this was really interesting when I was reading this. I was thinking about how we often want to try to have these wonderful smelling vaginas, and we talk about all of the things that are out on the market to try to have you smelling like, I don't know, diced pineapples and all that stuff Rick Ross raps about. But we don't want to be altering our vaginal microbiome during pregnancy. We really don't want to be altering it ever, because your vagina is not supposed to smell like diced pineapples. It's supposed to smell like a vagina. And we have a specific bacterial neighborhood down there that has healthy bacteria that keeps the vagina at the right chemical balance. And so there are bacteria, there are a few little yeast scattered in there that are supposed to be there, and it all works together to keep the vagina at a healthy pH balance. When we start altering things down there, stuff can get messed up and you can have an overgrowth of unhealthy bacteria, and that can cause some real problems. So we don't want to be doing douching and using a lot of chemicals down there. Some of these things that I see out on the market that people are using to like have all these different scents down there and smells, and I mean, we just need to be using a pure soap and water and something that's pH balanced, and you know, really being careful about our hygiene during pregnancy especially, but really all the time. So be careful about that. If you know that you're prone to getting yeast or bacterial infections, pregnancy is not going to make that better. In fact, it may make it worse. So it's really important that you especially refrain from using a lot of chemicals, a lot of soaps, and if you like colorful underwear, you may want to think about a white cotton liner that doesn't have a lot of dyes or chemicals in it. And also, you may want to think about starting a probiotic, and I really highly recommend probiotics. Make sure you're getting enough water intake because it's very important for the vaginal health. If you enjoy yogurt, you may want to think about having some active yogurt cultures. There's all kind of probiotic juices out there now, so keeping that vaginal microbiome healthy is super important all the time, but even more so during your pregnancy. Because getting frequent bouts of bacterial vaginosis is not the look you want during pregnancy, because we know that frequent BV is associated with preterm birth. Next, let's move on to the uterus's favorite neighbor, the bladder. Bladder infections can also cause increased risk of preterm birth. So if you're having frequent bladder infections, we also need to think about our diet, what we're drinking, and how we are taking care of our hygiene in that area. So making sure we're wiping from front to back towards the toilet. The bladder literally lives right on the uterus, and you can get bad bladder infections during pregnancy that can lead to contractions and preterm labor, which might put you at risk for preterm birth. Another infection that we want to keep our eye on is cervicitis. And cervicitis is a fancy word for cervical infections, y'all. So cervical infections are normally caused by sexually transmitted infections, usually the bacterial ones like gonorrhea, chlamydia, trichomoniasis. If you ain't seen my playlist on sexually transmitted infections, you want to check that one out. But this is one that we can control. So we want to keep ourselves safe, particularly during pregnancy, because infections on our cervix can lead to preterm contractions, which can lead to preterm birth. So be careful about the partners that you're choosing. Be careful about making sure that you are practicing safer sex using condoms. Do your best to take care of yourself all the time. But at pregnancy, we are not only taking care of ourselves, we're taking care of our little ones. So keep your eye on the ball with regards to sex. Unfortunately, I see this all the time, and it really sucks and it kind of pisses me off, but sometimes our partners don't know how to remain faithful during pregnancy. So you cannot necessarily rely on that faithfulness. So you gotta kind of keep watch over that. And I would recommend using condoms during pregnancy anyway, because sperm in the vagina sometimes causes preterm contractions. So using a condom is just an easier way to go about sex during pregnancy anyway. So protect yourself and protect your baby, and avoid the cramping and annoying preterm contractions that can come with having sperm inside the vagina. I think it's a win-win situation, but do what works for you. Finally, the last infection that we want to be aware of is infections inside the uterus. And this is one that may be a little bit more difficult for us to control, because sometimes this can happen even when you're doing all of the precautions, and it can happen randomly. It's fairly rare, especially when the bag of water around the baby is still intact. It's pretty difficult for bacteria in the vagina to get up inside the uterus when that bag is still intact, but it does happen every now and then, and sometimes we can see that cause some problems for some mamas. So those are things that can lead to spontaneous preterm birth just because of inflammation and the inflammatory process. So infection is number 2 and something that we really want to pay attention to. Making sure that we're practicing good hygiene, being careful about safer sex practices, wiping ourselves properly, and having a good diet, consuming plenty of water, and adding a probiotic if we feel like that's right for us. All right, so here we go. We're down to number 1. And let me just say that I was sort of surprised by this being number 1, but then not really, because it sort of makes sense. So number 1, believe this or not, was stress. Y'all, stress. Stress was the number 1 cause of spontaneous preterm birth. And there were 2 forms of stress that actually were associated with preterm birth. One was fetal stress, so the baby being stressed out. And the baby being stressed out was usually caused by insufficient oxygen supplies. So this was happening when there was not enough oxygen transfer from the uterus to the placenta, and then subsequently oxygen from the placenta to the baby. So that's a term we call uteroplacental insufficiency. And so when there is not enough blood flow from the uterus to the placenta, and there's not enough oxygen going to the baby's brain, there's a special part in the baby's brain called the hypothalamus that communicates with the pituitary gland in the brain, that then communicates with the adrenal gland, which is right above their kidneys. And they have this kind of cycle of communication that sets off a whole hormonal cascade that says to the mom's body, hey, evacuate me. So the baby is sending these hormonal messages to the mom's body like, hey, get me out of here. And so the mom's body then kicks into labor. So it starts off preterm labor, which is amazing. I think the body is so amazing, and that communication between mom and baby. And the baby is saying, hey, this is no longer a safe space for me. I need to get out. So the baby is actually sending off that cascade to tell mom, get me out of here. And then the other form of stress was maternal stress. And this is the one that really got me thinking about some of the mamas that I serve. And it was about the mom having stress, really high stress lifestyle, or a really high stress situation, or anxiety and depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. And though the maternal type of stress was not as strongly associated with spontaneous preterm birth, it still was a factor. And studies have found that moms who are dealing with depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress disorder were 2 times more likely to have spontaneous preterm birth than moms who were not. So when this maternal stress happens, the same exact thing happens in the mom. So her hypothalamus in her brain communicates with her pituitary gland in her brain, and the pituitary gland communicates with her adrenal glands by her kidneys, and they set off this cascade of, this is not a safe environment for this baby, evacuate the baby. So when we are not a safe space for the baby, it tells our body, hey, time to get this baby out of here. It's not a good space. You're not able to really provide a nurturing environment. And that's so interesting to me. The most interesting thing that I read was that these studies that were showing how the more severe your depression, anxiety was, the higher your risk for spontaneous preterm birth. And so that is so compelling for treatment of these conditions in pregnancy. And I talk to my mamas all the time about how you don't want to expose your baby to depression, anxiety, or your mental illness, because that's more dangerous than exposing your baby to medication. So if you know that you are dealing with severe depression, anxiety, you need to be treated. Don't forego treatment because you think that it's going to harm your baby. Your depression, anxiety is going to harm your baby. Preterm birth, like we talked about last Sunday, is not healthy for your baby. And as a matter of fact, it can be harmful. In fact, preterm birth is probably the #1 killer of babies in the United States. So we need to do a better job about communicating about mental health, because mental health is so serious and we need to be talking about it a lot more, and we need to be treating it a lot better. And I know we've talked about this in other Super Mama Sundays, but making sure that you are getting the right help so that you can get well is so important, not only for your pregnancy, but also for the newborn period, because being able to bond with and mother your baby is absolutely important for you and for that baby and for your family and your relationships. So stress should not be the cause of you having a baby prematurely. We need to deal with it. And if you haven't talked to your OB care provider because you're embarrassed or you don't think they would be interested in that, the next time you see them, do me a favor and speak up about it. Because you do not deserve to go through a preterm birth and having a baby in the NICU because you didn't feel comfortable speaking up. I hope that you guys enjoyed today's video. Hope you got a lot out of it. I got a lot out of learning about these top 5 topics for this week. And I hope that you'll put your questions and your comments down below so that we can talk about them some more. And definitely subscribe so that you can be on board for next week. And I will see you next Sunday, Super Mamas. Peace.